My daughter called me from a stranger's office. And the first thing she said wasn't Mommy, it was why. I was sitting in the back of a black car threading through Houston's Galleria traffic, half listening to my assistant run through my afternoon schedule, when my phone buzzed with Lily's number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. She was supposed to be getting ice cream with my parents in River Oaks, a Tuesday afternoon treat. Totally routine, the kind of grandparent thing that made me feel like maybe our family was finally finding its rhythm after the divorce. I picked up because something in my chest moved wrong, like a piano was snapping quietly inside a wall. Mommy, that single word, stretched thin and soaked through with the kind of confusion that 7-year-olds should never have to feel, stopped every thought I'd ever had. There's a lady here and she's writing my name on a paper and Grandma and Grandpa left, and they said you know about it. I told my driver to turn around before she finished the sentence. I didn't know. I did not know. I have never in my life moved through Houston traffic the way I moved through it that afternoon, white-knuckling the door handle while my heart did something between free-falling and igniting. And I kept Lily on the phone the entire time, telling her she was safe, telling her I was coming, telling her the things a mother says when she's so furious she can barely see straight, but she cannot let her child hear that fury because the child is already terrified enough. It took me for hours because of a wreck on 59 and a bureaucratic process at the group home that required I produce identification and my custody documentation before they would release her to me. 4 hours during which my parents did not once pick up their phones that night. After Lily was asleep in my bed with every light in the room on because she didn't want the dark anymore, I sat at my kitchen island in our Tanglewood townhouse with a glass of wine I never drank. And I thought about what my mother had said to me 6 weeks earlier. She'd said it over brunch at Brennan's, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin, wearing the pearl earrings my father gave her for their anniversary, smiling the way she always smiles when she's about to say something she's been rehearsing. She said, Katie, you cannot raise that child properly while you're doing all of this. All of this. My law practice. My post-divorce life. My refusal to move back into the River Oaks estate the way she'd suggested after my ex-husband Trent and I split. I told her I was doing fine. She smiled again and said, Of course you are, sweetheart. I should have heard the period at the end of that sentence. I should have heard the door closing. But here's what nobody understood about Renata and Harold Bellamy. They had spent 40 years being right about everything. Harold built Bellamy Capital from a Houston oil family legacy into one of the most quietly powerful private equity firms in Texas. And Renata had built the social infrastructure around it, the way an architect builds load-bearing walls. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They simply arranged things. And then the things happened. And by the time you understood what had occurred, the paperwork was already filed and the narrative was already set. That was the Bellamy way. I had been raised inside that machine and I had spent my entire adult life trying to convince myself I had escaped it. And sitting at that kitchen island, I finally understood, with the kind of cold clarity that only comes from watching your mother drive away, laughing on security footage, that I had never escaped anything. Now, here's the part they didn't plan for. The part where the daughter they underestimated went to work. I called my attorney at 7 the next morning. Not my divorce attorney, my criminal attorney. A woman named Petra Hale who I had worked with on 2 separate high-profile custody cases, and who I trusted with my life precisely because she was meaner than anyone I had ever met in a courtroom. Petra picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd already heard something because Petra never picks up before the third ring. I told her everything. The ice cream, the orphanage, technically a licensed group home for displaced children on Bel Air Boulevard, which made the whole thing somehow more calculated and more devastating at once. The 4 hours. The bureaucratic nightmare. The phone calls my parents never returned. When I finished, Petra was quiet for exactly 4 seconds and then she said, Katie, does that facility have cameras? I said I assume so. She said, get me the name of the director and don't call your parents back. Don't call them at all. I asked her what she was thinking. She said, I'm thinking your mother and father just handed us everything we need. I didn't fully understand what she meant yet. I would. The facilities director, a composed woman named Sandra Owens who had been running that group home for 11 years and who I could tell was deeply disturbed by what had happened. called me back within 24 hours of Petra's outreach. Sandra told me that my parents had arrived at 10:47 in the morning, that they had entered a document, a typed letter on what appeared to be legal stationery, claiming that I had authorized them to act as emergency guardians and that I was undergoing a mental health evaluation that made me temporarily unfit. She said they had been calm, professional, that my father had done most of the talking while my mother stood slightly behind him, and that when Sandra had expressed uncertainty and said she would need to make some calls, my father had said, and she read this from her notes, that won't be necessary. Her mother and I have handled everything on our end. Then they'd signed the intake paperwork, handed Lily a juice box from their car, told her to be a good girl, and left. Sandra said she'd gone to her window because something felt wrong and she'd watched their black Mercedes pull out of the parking lot. She said my father was driving and my mother had her hand on his arm, and they were. She paused before she said it, laughing. She said she stood there for a moment feeling sick before going back to Lily, who was sitting in a chair in the office still holding the juice box, not crying yet. Still in that stunned pre-cry space where children go when the world has done something they don't have language for. That image, my daughter in that chair, confused, waiting, is the image I will carry to my grave, but it's also the image that ended them. Here is what I need you to understand about the Bellamys before I tell you what happened next. They had spent 30 years insulating themselves from consequence. Harold had a foundation. Renata chaired to hospital boards. They gave the right amounts to the right people in the right election cycles. They had a family attorney named Clifford Payne who had been cleaning up after them since 1987 and who probably knew more about the architecture of their financial and social power than anyone alive. When the divorce from Trent had gotten ugly, and it had, briefly, because Trent Calloway was not a man who accepted the word no gracefully, it was Clifford who had sat across from my attorney and implied, without ever saying anything actionable, that a custody fight might surface certain things about my professional life that I wouldn't want surfaced. I had backed down then. I had agreed to terms I didn't like because I was tired and because I believed, wrongly, that protecting Lily meant protecting the peace. My parents had approved of that decision. They'd called it mature. Now I understood what they'd actually called it. A test, a proof of concept. They'd needed to know whether I would fold, and I had, and that had told them something about me that they'd carried forward into their planning. They thought they knew exactly what I would do. They thought they knew my limits. They were about to discover they had miscalculated by about a decade. Petra filed the complaint for attempted abandonment of a minor on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Houston PD had contacted my parents' attorney. By Friday, I had received 2 calls from Clifford Payne's office asking if we could discuss the matter as a family before things escalated. Which is lawyers speak for your parents are scared and want this to disappear. I didn't take the calls. I let them go to Petra's office, which was its own kind of message. On Saturday morning, I was sitting with Lily at our kitchen table doing a puzzle, a 1,000-piece map of the United States that she'd gotten for Christmas, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't have saved. It said, "You don't know what you're starting. There are things about your marriage you've never been told. Call me." C. I stared at that text for a long time. The C could have been Clifford. It could have been half a dozen people in the Bellamy orbit. But the phrasing, "things about your marriage," landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples didn't stop. I had spent 14 months believing the end of my marriage was straightforward. Trent had been difficult, controlling in the financial sense, bad at intimacy, worse at honesty. We'd grown into strangers who shared a mortgage, and a dinner table and a daughter. We both loved differently. I had filed, he had fought briefly, we had settled. That was the story I knew. The story I had built my recovery on. The story I had told my therapist and my best friend and myself every night before I fell asleep for over a year. Things about your marriage you've never been told. 7 words, and suddenly that story felt like a set of stage flats, beautiful from the front, hollow behind, and propped up by something I hadn't thought to look for. I showed the text to Petra. She told me not to respond. She told me it was almost certainly a pressure tactic. A way of introducing chaos into my decision-making to make me second-guess the filing. She was probably right. Petra was almost always right. But I noticed she said almost certainly and not definitely. And I filed that distinction away, and I did not forget it. What I found when I started looking wasn't what I expected. It was worse. The next 2 weeks were a kind of double life I had not anticipated. On the surface, I was a mother holding it together, taking Lily to school, meeting clients, going to the gym, answering texts with a steadiness that I was constructing entirely from will. Underneath, I was pulling at threads. I still had access to some of Trent's old calendar archives from the shared family account we'd never fully disentangled, a clerical oversight nobody had noticed. And I started going back through them. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I told myself I was just being thorough, just covering my bases, just doing what a good attorney would do when someone sends an anonymous threat and calls it information. But the truth is I was scared, and when I'm scared I organize, I categorize, I build timelines, because that is the only way I know how to metabolize fear. 3 days in, I found a recurring calendar event from 2 years ago. Every other Wednesday. Blocked as client dinner, Galleria area. Nothing unusual about that. Trent ran a commercial real estate firm and client dinners were constant. Except that when I cross-referenced those dates against the credit card statements I still had from our joint account, there were no restaurant charges. There were no charges at all on any of those Wednesday nights. Trent had been going somewhere that cost nothing and leaving no record. And he had been doing it for 8 months of our marriage. And neither I nor anyone else had ever noticed. I sat with that for a day before I did the next thing. The next thing was calling a private investigator named Samson Burke, who I had used once on a client case, and whose discretion I trusted completely. I gave Samson the dates and asked him to start there. He asked me what I was hoping to find. I told him I was hoping to find nothing. He said that in his experience that was the most common thing clients told him, and it was the most reliable predictor of what they were actually about to find. He said it gently, and he wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, my parents had retained outside criminal counsel in addition to Clifford, a high-profile defense attorney, out of Austin named Barrett Finch, who was known for making difficult cases disappear through procedural attrition. And Petra told me to expect a motion challenging the legal basis of the abandonment charge on the grounds that they had presented what they believed was legitimate authorization documentation. That was going to be their play. They were going to argue good faith. They were going to say they genuinely believed they were acting in Lily's best interest, that I had communicated distress, that they had panicked and made a poor decision, that it was a family misunderstanding that had been catastrophically mishandled, but had never constituted criminal intent. And the frustrating thing, the thing that kept me up at 3 a.m. staring at my ceiling, was that if the security footage hadn't existed, that argument might have worked. Because that's how good they were. That's how thoroughly the Bellamys had always prepared the story they needed the world to believe. But the security footage did exist. And Sandra Owens had already made copies, and those copies were with the prosecutor's office. And on that footage, you could see my mother, Renata Bellamy, in her Chanel jacket and her pearl earrings. The woman who had raised me, who had sung me to sleep, who had held my hand at my grandmother's funeral, laughing as she walked away from a building where she had just left her 7-year-old granddaughter with strangers. There is no good faith argument that survives that footage. Not in a Houston courtroom. Not anywhere. And yet, as certain as I felt standing on the ground I was standing on, there was something else coming. Something the security footage couldn't explain. Something that had started 2 years before any of this, and that I still didn't have the full shape of. I could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, not seeing it yet, but knowing, bone deep, that whatever was moving toward me was going to change everything I thought I understood about my own life. Samson called me on a Tuesday evening while I was helping Lily with her homework. I stepped into the hallway, closed the kitchen door, and stood in the dim light of my front entryway while he told me what he'd found. His voice was level and careful the way voices get when the person speaking has practiced delivering information that the person receiving it is not going to be able to unhear. He said he had tracked 2 of the calendar dates through a combination of cell tower data from Trent's old number illegally obtained through a method he was confident about and cross-referenced. Then with building access records from a River Oaks address he'd identified. He said the address was a private residence. He said the residence was owned through an LLC established in Delaware in 2019. He said the registered agent for that LLC was Clifford Payne. He said the beneficial owner, after 2 layers of corporate structure, was Harold Bellamy. My father owned a house that his own attorney had helped him hide, and my ex-husband had been visiting it every other Wednesday night for 8 months of our marriage. And no one had ever told me. I pressed my back against the wall and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. I asked Samson one question. I said, "Is there anything else?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Katie, I think you need to sit down for the next part." I told him I was already on the floor. He said, "That LLC has a second owner. 50%. Her name is Vanessa Rowe. She's 34. She was a junior associate at Bellamy Capital from 2018 to 2021. He paused. Then, she left the company in March of 2021 with a severance package that is extraordinarily large for her role. The same month you filed for divorce. I said nothing. The hallway was very quiet. Through the closed kitchen door, I could hear Lily humming to herself, some song from school, small and sweet and completely unaware. And then Samson said the one thing that unraveled every version of my life I'd ever believed in. He said, "Miss Katie, I need to ask you something. And I need you to answer me honestly. Does the name Vanessa Rowe mean anything to you?" And here's what happened inside me in the silence before I answered. Not rage, not tears. Something quieter and more dangerous, the feeling of a very long equation finally balancing, all the variables clicking into place. And the answer being something you had almost known for years, but had refused to let yourself know because the knowing would have cost too much. My mother had introduced me to Trent. She had called him perfect. She had pushed the relationship from the first dinner to the engagement to the wedding with a persistence I had always attributed to her love of tradition and her need for social symmetry. What if it had never been about me? What if the whole marriage, my marriage, 14 years, the thing I had built my identity around, the thing I had survived the ending of, had been a transaction that I was the last person on earth to understand? I said, "No, I don't know that name." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't going to be true for very much longer. The name Vanessa Rowe felt like a splinter under my thumbnail, small, unreachable, and impossible to ignore. I didn't sleep that night. I put Lily to bed, kissed her forehead, checked the lock on her window the way I'd been checking every lock in our house since the orphanage. And then I went to my home office and I pulled up everything I could find. LinkedIn, Texas bar records, Harris County property filings. The Bellamy Capital Archive Press releases still cached in Google from before the company went to a private-only digital presence in 2022. Vanessa Rowe had graduated from at Austin in 2013, gotten an MBA from Rice in 2017, and joined Bellamy Capital the following year as an analyst working in the acquisitions division. Her LinkedIn profile was scrubbed, cleaner profile photo removed, employment dates gone. The kind of deliberate digital erasure that doesn't happen by accident and doesn't happen without someone with resources helping you do it. But she had existed, and she had left in March of 2021. And that month was seared into my memory because March of 2021 was the month I had found the first thing that made me start thinking about divorce. It had not been anything dramatic, not lipstick on a collar, not a late-night text from an unknown number. It had been a feeling, a persistent, cellular wrongness that I had tried to medicate with yoga and wine and a solo trip to Santa Fe that my mother had encouraged with unusual enthusiasm. I had come back from Santa Fe and told Trent I needed more from our marriage, and Trent had said, with a flatness that scared me, "I know." 2 words. The tone of a man who had been waiting for a door to open. I had filed 3 weeks later. I had thought, all this time, that I had been the one who ended it, that I had made the choice, that I had acted. I was beginning to understand that I had been released. What happens to a woman when she realizes that the most important decisions of her adult life were made for her, around her, without her knowledge? I'll tell you what happens. She gets very, very still. And then she gets to work. Petra called me the next morning before I'd had coffee. She said the Harris County DA's office had made a decision. They were not only proceeding with the abandonment charge, they were adding a charge of filing a false instrument. Based on the forged authorization letter my parents had presented to Sandra Owens, Barrett Finch. My parents' high-powered Austin attorney had already called to request a meeting. Petra said he'd used the word resolution for times in 2 minutes, which he said was the verbal equivalent of a white flag wrapped in a suit jacket. I told Petra to set the meeting, but I told her something else first. I told her about Samsung's findings. The LLC, the house. Clifford Payne's name on the registration. Vanessa Rowe, the severance package. The timeline. There was a silence on the other end of the phone that I had never heard from Petra before. Petra, who had sat across from federal prosecutors and never flinched. Petra, who had once cross-examined a sitting city councilman for 4 hours without raising her voice. She said, "Katie, are you telling me your father was hiding a woman your ex-husband was seeing in a property he owned during your marriage?" I said I was telling her what Samson had found and that I needed her to tell me what it meant legally. She said, "It means a lot of things. It means possible fraud on the marital estate if Trent had knowledge of assets your father concealed. It means potential conflict of interest for Clifford Payne on your divorce proceedings if he knew. It means," she paused, "it means your settlement might be entirely reopenable." I closed my eyes. 14 months of rebuilding my life on what I had believed was solid ground. And the ground had always been hollow. I want to be precise about what happened next because I've had people ask me since, at dinner parties, in the careful way that wealthy Houston women ask questions they desperately want the answers to, whether I lost myself in it, whether the anger took me somewhere I couldn't come back from. The answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is Lily. Every single decision I made in the weeks that followed was made through the prism of her face in that chair in Sandra Owens's office. Still holding the juice box, waiting to understand something that no 7-year-old should have to understand. I was not going to blow up my life and hers in a storm of rage. I was going to be surgical. I was going to be my father's daughter in every way he had never intended. Samson found Vanessa Rowe 3 weeks into the search. She was living in Austin, East Austin, a converted bungalow on Chicken Street, quietly, under her own name because she had probably calculated that enough time and enough distance made that safe. She was working as a consultant for a small real estate development firm and she was, according to Samson's observations, apparently trying to live a normal life. I did not send a process server. I did not have Petra file anything yet. I drove to Austin on a Thursday morning, alone, in my own car, and I knocked on her door. I had thought about this moment for weeks. I had rehearsed it, discarded the rehearsal, rehearsed it again. When she opened the door, she was in jeans and a University of Texas sweatshirt, hair pulled back, and she looked at me for exactly 1 second before her face did the thing that told me everything. Not surprise, recognition. She had known this day was coming. She had been waiting for me the way I had been waiting for the full truth. We sat on her back porch for 2 hours. She drank coffee. I drank water. And she told me everything. Everything is a word that sounds large until it lands. And then it lands like a building. Vanessa had not been simply an associate at Bellamy Capital. She had been Harold's project, not romantically, nothing like that, something both colder and more useful. Harold had identified her early as someone brilliant and ambitious and, critically, without the kind of family connections or financial safety net that would give her the leverage to say no to things she probably should have said no to. He had promoted her fast, paid her well, made her feel like she was being brought into something real and important. And then, 18 months into her tenure, he had asked her to do something. He had introduced her to Trent Calloway at a Bellamy Capital event, and he had told her, not suggested, told her that it would be good for the firm if Trent had a reason to stay close to the Bellamy family during a period when Harold was trying to finalize a very large joint acquisition. Trent and I were already engaged by then. We had been together for years. Harold had watched us together for 4 years and had calculated that I, Katie Bellamy, the daughter, the attorney, the woman who had the inconvenient habit of asking questions, was going to be a structural liability in a transaction that needed to proceed cleanly and quietly. He needed Trent compliant. He needed Trent with something to lose if he talked. And so he had handed Trent a beautiful, brilliant woman and a hidden property, and the implicit understanding that as long as everyone played their roles, everyone would be protected. Vanessa had believed she was making a career calculation. She had not understood, until it was too late, that she was being used as a piece on a board in a game whose rules she had never been shown. When the acquisition finalized in early 2021 and Harold no longer needed the arrangement, he had ended it, paid Vanessa handsomely and efficiently, moved her out of the company and out of Trent's orbit, and trusted that the money would buy silence. He had not anticipated that 2 years of being used as a human instrument of manipulation might leave a person with feelings about the experience that no severance package could fully address. I asked Vanessa if she would testify. She looked at her coffee for a long time. She said, "To what?" I said, "To all of it. The LLC, the arrangement. What Harold told you. What Clifford knew." She said, "You understand what that does to my life." I said, "I understand what it does to mine if you don't." She was quiet. I watched a mockingbird in her yard cycle through about 6 different songs. Then she said, "He told me you were unstable, that you were difficult, that Trent was unhappy and it wasn't his fault." I said I knew. I said, "That's what he tells people about the things he can't control." She looked up at me then, really looked at me, and she said, "He did the same thing to you that he did to me. He just did it your whole life." I said yes. She said, "I'll testify." That was the moment the whole thing turned. That was the crack in the foundation that brought the house down. What followed over the next 4 months was the kind of legal process that moved slowly and then all at once. Petra and a civil litigation partner from her firm deposed Clifford Payne, whose absolute terror at being deposed was itself a form of confession. He invoked attorney-client privilege 17 times in 3 hours, which when you're an attorney, you know, is not something an innocent man does. He resigned from the Bellamy family retainer 2 days after the deposition, which Harold had not expected and which left him, for the first time in his adult life, legally exposed without his usual insulation. Samson found 2 more transactions connected to the Delaware LLC, a second property, and what appeared to be a series of payments to a shell company that Trent had set up during our marriage. The fraud on the marital estate claim became real, documented, provable. The divorce settlement was reopened. My attorneys filed a motion for sanctions against Clifford personally for the potential conflict of interest during the original proceedings, which was a separate track that I understood might not go anywhere, but which served its own purpose in making the scope of this clear to everyone watching. The criminal case against my parents came to its resolution on a cold February morning in Harris County. I was there with Petra and with Sandra Owens, who had agreed to serve as a witness, and with Lily, who did not come inside the courthouse, but who sat in the car with my best friend Dorinda eating chips and doing her homework. Harold and Renata Bellamy, Harold in a dark suit, Renata in a grey wool coat that she had clearly chosen for its air of dignity, stood in a courtroom and entered guilty pleas to a reduced charge of child endangerment, negotiated down from the abandonment and false instrument charges in exchange for cooperation and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing that was part of the plea record. They did not get jail time. That was the part of the agreement I had struggled with. The part I had sat with Petra about for 2 hours arguing back and forth. Because there is a version of me that wanted them in a cell, and I won't pretend otherwise. But Petra explained the calculation to me, and I trusted her. What they got instead was 3 years of probation, mandatory family court oversight, a permanent notation on the criminal record that would follow Harold's professional reputation into every future boardroom and regulatory filing, and a civil judgment in the reop and divorce proceedings. That returned to me a sum of money I am not going to specify, but which was significant enough that, when my father heard the number, he closed his eyes and kept them closed for a long time. The civil case naming Clifford Payne settled separately, quietly. 2 months later, my mother looked at me in the hallway outside the courtroom after it was done. She looked at me the way she sometimes had when I was small and had done something that surprised her. Not angry exactly, but recalibrating. Like she was seeing me with different measurements. She started to say something. I don't know what it was going to be. Sorry, maybe, or something else. Something that would have sounded like sorry, but contained an explanation or a justification or a Renata Bellamy refinement of the concept of accountability. I didn't find out. I turned and walked back down the hallway to the elevator. And I pressed the button, and I went to my daughter, because Here is what I know now that I didn't know the day she called. Me from that office dot, I know that the most dangerous thing about people who are used to power is that they have never genuinely had to account for their choices. Every mistake gets smoothed. Every consequence gets managed. Every version of events that doesn't suit them gets revised until the revision becomes the memory, becomes the truth. And they live so comfortably inside that truth that they actually believe it. My parents believed that what they did to Lily was an act of care, or they told themselves they believed it, which is not the same thing, but which allows you to sleep at night. They had decided I was failing, and in the Bellamy calculus, when someone is failing, you take action. You do not ask. You do not wait. You arrange. They had arranged, and they had not imagined, had genuinely not imagined, I think, that the daughter they had spent her whole life arranging around would arrange right back, only better, only with documentation, only with the precision they had trained her for without ever intending to train her for exactly this. Trent and I don't speak. We communicate through attorneys about Lily's schedule, and we do it efficiently and without drama because Lily is the thing neither of us will weaponize. He knows what I know. He knows I know what I know. The day Petra served him with the motion to reopen the settlement was the day the flatness I had seen in him during our marriage finally made sense to me. He had always been waiting for something to land. Now it had landed. He was managing the consequences of it the way he managed everything, quietly, expensively, without apparent feeling. I no longer wonder what he feels. That chapter is finished, and I've made my peace with it, or I'm making my peace with it daily, which is the more accurate version. Vanessa Rowe sent me a text for weeks after the plea hearing. It said, "I hope you're okay." I sat with that for a while, and then I wrote back, "I'm better than okay. Thank you." She wrote, "Same." That was all. I don't know what her life looks like now, or what she's building, or whether we will ever speak again. What I know is that she told the truth when it mattered, and that cost her something real, and I won't forget that. Lily started second grade in the fall. She has a teacher named Miss Patterson who she loves unreasonably and a best friend named Cora who comes over every Saturday and eats everything in our refrigerator and makes Lily laugh the way only a best friend can. She does not talk about the orphanage much. She talked about it with her therapist, Dr. Rene, for several months, the juice box, the chair, the waiting, the why. And Dr. Rene tells me she is processing it the way children process things when they feel safe, which is slowly and sideways and mostly through play. On a Sunday in November, Lily was drawing at the kitchen table and she looked up at me and said, "Mommy, were you scared when you were coming to get me?" I sat down next to her. I said, "Yes, I was very scared." She said, "But you came." I said, "I will always come." She looked at me for a moment with those dark eyes that are her father's shape, and my mother's color, and somehow entirely her own. And she nodded once, like a verdict, and went back to her drawing. That is the image I choose. Not the security footage. Not my mother's coat in the courthouse hallway. Not my father's closed eyes. I choose Lily at the kitchen table, drawing. Certain, I am 38 years old. I live in a townhouse in Tanglewood, Houston, with my daughter and plants I have somehow kept alive. And I run my law practice, and I pay my own bills, and I have learned, finally and permanently, and at the cost of things I will not minimize, that the most revolutionary act available to a woman who was raised to be manageable is to become, very quietly and very completely, unmanageable. They gave her juice box and drove away laughing. They forgot one thing. They forgot who her mother was. They remembered by the end.
Quick check-in, where are you watching from? Drop it below and make sure to subscribe for upcoming stories. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. A new story is coming soon. Until then, stay strong and don't lose hope.